Thank you for having me. Can you hear me? Okay. I think I have to wait for it to go on. Yes? It should be on now. Can you still not hear me? You can hear it, right? Okay. I think it's just the quietness of a New Yorker. It's still not on. I don't mind holding it up this way. Now you can hear me. I'll just hold it this way. That's fine. Don't worry. You can. Oh, okay. All right. Can you hear me now? It's better? Not really. You know what? I don't mind holding it. He'll turn it up. Okay. So I'm sitting. I've been up since 3 in the morning New York time. So, but why? Because I really did think it was important to come and meet with you. Now, first, when I accepted the invitation, I heard Stanford and I thought Connecticut, so I thought it would be a drive. But then I decided that it was important enough to come here. I think we're in very challenging times, and I think we really have to, not only as a state where I sit in New York, but as a country, really look together at where are we headed, and how can we find some common ground to move forward. And before I became a commissioner, I was never a decision maker. I always worked for decision makers. So when I took this role in 2013, it was very important for me that I look at sort of the rich history. We're celebrating in New York 110 years at the Commission. And it's very important for me that I really take stock of that. And that really guides me in my role as a commissioner. The Commission does, as Diane talked about, regulates electric, gas, steam, telecommunications, cable, and water utilities in New York. And we have in New York, similar to California, a very broad mandate to ensure that consumers receive safe and reliable utility service at reasonable rates and with the least adverse effect on the environment. The Commission really stands in New York at the crossroads of the public need for virtually essential core services and the private needs of the shareholders to ensure continued investment in these services. As such, we occupy an incredibly important and unique role to balance these interests in a way that ensures the most advanced and reliable services while at the same time ensuring they are effectively and efficiently delivered. The critical importance of the Commission's mission is really for the economic well-being of the state and its citizens, and that can't be overstated. And for 110 years, the Commission has navigated this weighty responsibility over the years effectively, and at the same time, we assumed a leadership role in developing innovative policies in both energy and telecommunications areas. In fact, New York Commission has generally been considered the national leader and pioneer on so many fronts. For example, the Commission was the first to forge forward-looking competitive telecommunications policy and brought real choice and a dynamic telecommunications market to New York's businesses and residents well before the 1996 Telecommunications Act. It also played a leading role in sound competitive energy policies, while at the same time being careful to protect the reliability of electric and gas supplies, the stability of the companies, and consumer protections of the energy customers. So I really sit committed to ensuring the Commission continues to add real value to the people of New York. To me, I really have, and want to take this sort of more on a personal level, why a state regulator like myself thinks it's important to talk globally on energy issues. I have 3 sort of pivotal points in my life that energy was a significant part of. Back in 1977, when I was about 10 years old, I was in New York City. I know I just dated myself. That used to sound young. Now it sounds old, right? I was a young child in a wheelchair, and I was in New York City for hospitals for special surgery, having some surgery, very intense. And there was the blackout of 1977. So for many hours, the hospital was operating on a generator, very dark, a lot of people, a lot of issues, dealing with a lot of chronic patients, and running out of gas for their generators and not knowing what would happen and trying to figure out what to do. Luckily, things got resolved, but there was, from that point forward, a discussion in New York City, an investigation of the blackout of 1977, and a discussion of what we needed to do and what the role of the state was, what the role of the city was, what the role of the utilities were. A lot of different policies got implemented from then. But I have the memory of that 10-year-old child being in the room right outside in front of the nurse's station and hearing them discussing the scared nurses and the doctors and the workers trying to figure out what to do if the generator didn't continue. So it was really, for me as a 10-year-old, and though I didn't really realize it, it had a real impact on me that when the lights go out, your safety is at risk, and the parents and the adults who are there to protect you may not know what to do. And so I really had that as sort of a always focused in some fashion. So now, a few years later, fast forward, I'm a mother. I have 2 children. Right now, one who is 20. I have a 13-year-old who thinks he's 25. But it was back in 2003, and my youngest was born June 10th, and now it's August, so it's relatively new as a mother of 2 children, 7-year-old and a newborn. And I had just started back at work, my first week at work. And I'm driving home, and all of a sudden all the streetlights are out. There's a lot of noise, there's confusion, and trying to figure out what to do. And then I hear on the radio that there also is a outage, massive, all kinds of images of what this means, terrorism, etc. And as I sat there in my car trying to figure out how to get home safely, pick up both of my children from daycare, I was also in the unique position of having a freezer full of breast milk. And that image of myself of coming home and knowing that I hoped that my electricity was running, but knowing that from the little bit I could gather that there was really very little chance of that. So coming home and really seeing, talk about spilled milk, really that image for me of that breakdown of what I saw, again, as looking at when I was a 10-year-old, looking to be protected, and now as a mother realizing that I also couldn't control my electricity. And I will tell you that, that's a big issue for me, in that all of my milk was spoiled, it was gone, I had to throw it out. And I say that really because it really does, for me, define who I am as a regulator, which is that it's personal. It's personal, our energy choices and our energy usage and the security of having that. So now, a few years later, fast forward again, this is my third sort of event that sort of defines, for me, energy. I told you I was in a wheelchair as a child for almost 2 years, dealt with some incredible doctors who were able to deal with the condition that I have. And then I suffered a setback later in life, and I only have the use of these 2 fingers here. But I had undergone some surgery because I didn't have the use of my arm at all. And so I had brain surgery, and I have a stimulator in my brain, which is amazing, again, technology and modern medicine. But what it means is that every night I need to charge my battery that's here where this is, right? Maybe that's the issue. And it needs to be plugged in. So there is an issue for me in always needing to be somewhere where I know that I have energy to charge my stimulator because it only lasts so long. And again, then dealing with the innovation that comes with that to help so that maybe it can be a longer battery storage for me. I am personal battery storage. But again, it's the event that really defines you in how you deal with it and how you figure out solutions. So for me as a regulator, I really keep those three personal events as something very, very important into looking at what do we do and how do we drive not only innovation but our policies. And I really believe that events drive policies, and the policies then get implemented. And the best way to have events and policies and implementation, and I'm a biker, so it's like a wheel. You want it to keep going, right? You don't want to have to worry about it being, getting a flat or being too pumped up or things. So it should go this way. But sometimes what happens is an event happens, and policymakers react to that event in a way that seems to solve the crisis of, well, we're never going to happen that again because we're going to do all these different policies, and that's what it's going to be. And we make policy decisions in this, what I call frantic mode, for addressing that particular event, that particular issue. And again, that same fear of wanting to just make sure that we're always okay. But then what happens is those policies have to get implemented. And if we haven't carefully thought through those policies and what the root causes of the event were and what the next steps are and what other things may come from that, what happens is the implementation becomes problematic. The policies don't match up. And then the next event showcases the dilemma we have in the policies that didn't address the event or didn't address the underlying things that also came that we weren't planning for. So that clear regulatory policy should really be looking at having that wheel so that it could really balance out and making sure that our events and our policies and our implementation are continually changing and moving and adapting as necessary. And I really do believe that as regulators, we need to not look at it as, well, now we have this regulation, we have this policy, and this is it. We need to be able to look at the flexibility of our regulations and the adaptability of our regulations to plan going forward for things that we may not be able to envision, but also to look at and say, if there are things that we don't know, which there will be, how do we have the flexibility to move on that? And how do we do it in a way that's not that knee-jerk way and is rather a way that's thoughtful and takes into account all the different dynamics that will happen, not just for the short term, but the long term. So I really do look and say, what do we do now? We have these challenges. There are different challenges between the states, primarily California and New York, and the federal administration. And we need to look at where the pathway is and the common ground. I do believe it's there. I do believe that there are things that we need to figure out as a state and as a country. And I do think that we also need to embrace the idea that we don't have all of the answers. And we need to look at what some of the knee-jerk reactions may be. Because states can do a lot outside of the administration. But the goal really should be, in my mind, is looking at how can you marry some of your common ground And how can you look at, yes, you may have the ability to do certain things. Again, New York sits in a very special place in that we in the commission have a broad mandate that we can do a lot of things outside of legislation. But we need to look at what the ramifications may be, how it may affect other things, how by operating in a silo at times, it may actually not provide the security or the reliability that we think will be there. And looking at it for the long term. I'm also very focused on the primary factor that's important is reliability. The integrity and reliability of the grid is very, very important. And so as I sit, I am an economic regulator. And as an economic regulator, I need to remember that my primary focus needs to be on the safety and reliability of the utility service and looking at the other aspects that come in. And again, understanding that there are regulations, that there are laws that also have us focus on the environment, but that overall we do need to look at the reliability of the system and the resiliency of the system. I strongly believe that part of that goes with always asking tough questions and also focusing on the different dynamics from the historical perspective, looking at what our fuel mix is, looking at some of our policies and where we'd like to be, and then asking the questions of how do we get there and the balance that gets there. So as a regulator, we need to balance not only the interests of the industry who wants to be able to do certain things, but we need to balance the customer who wants safe and affordable service. And we need to balance all of these interests so that we can actually make sure that we're moving in a pathway forward. I am open right now to questions. I could talk and do a couple of different things, but I am cognizant of the fact that we don't have that much time. So if anybody does have a question, feel free to raise your hand.
And always our policy students first, please. Any questions? Caught them off guard. At least we have a few more minutes. Any questions in general? Mm-hmm.
So thanks for the talk so far. So having lived in northern New Jersey for 10 years, I recall that New York City and upstate don't always see eye to eye. Can you talk about differences and how you resolve perhaps different priorities?
I think there are always challenges and opportunities. And it's no secret that sometimes there's the perception that there's an upstate and a downstate difference. As I look at it, my job really is to be an information gatherer, an information processor, and trying to figure out what the common ground is and looking at that. Our bread and butter are our rate cases. Our bread and butter is looking at what we're doing to make sure that the utilities are having safe and reliable service. That means making sure that they're well prepared, that they have their infrastructure in place, the replacement of that infrastructure, and looking at the different avenues to do that. But also, as we sit, one of the things that's important is technology and innovation. And I've struggled with that. I'm an OCD type of person, and I'm a micromanager, just ask my children. And one of the things that we have to do is we have to be able to figure out how to take a step back and not be so prescriptive that we're stopping the innovation that can happen. That's part of where we have our Reforming Energy Vision, which is focused on being able to allow some new innovation and technologies to be able to jumpstart not only our economy, but a better, greater, and more reliable system. So one of the things that I've struggled with is, what do we do? You know, you always hear, it's like, you know, the iPhone, right? Everybody wants the latest and greatest iPhone. I had a flip phone, until a few years ago. I love my flip phone. I had to get rid of it because I lost my cord and they didn't have it anymore. So that really, honestly, I still have it because I'm hoping that one day I'll find my cord. It's the phone that my husband first, we called my parents to say that we were engaged, so you have, right? I know, my kids think I'm crazy too. But when we look at it, one of the things that I see is how prescriptive do we need to be? And I've sort of, and I just want to make sure because I really have tried to look at it as that technology and advances in technology are very important. And they're important to establish an energy strategy centered on innovation, production, rather than regulation. So all of that's going to happen outside of regulation. And so while I'm focused on, as a regulator, do I approve X technology or Y technology or Z technology? At the end of the day, the New York City folks and the upstate folks, they're not focused on me and waiting for me to approve that. They're focused on having what they need, right? So from a technology perspective, that's the common ground. And from a technology perspective, I strongly believe that we should be focusing on performance-based standards rather than trying to be overly prescriptive. I think that is really an essential ingredient. And the best available technology today will likely not be the same in the future. My flip phone, iPhone 7, all of that. It's not necessarily the be-all and end-all, right? So if we prescribe which technology and even brand in regulations, that will stifle the innovation. That will reduce competition, and that actually will drive up prices. So for me, with everything, a more meaningful regulatory approach would be to set a performance threshold and let the market and the innovators meet or exceed these standards. And that's sort of the focus that I have as a regulator. I do think that workforce development is a significant piece of the puzzle. And so again, when I come back to it, that's an issue, workforce development. And so what is my role as a regulator in that, as a state regulator? So I've determined that I have to signal as a regulator a commitment to workforce in some fashion. So when I'm looking at a rate case and approving the structure that the utility has for their workforce, I have to look at it and see, is it sending a message to the workforce that the work will be there? We look at gas safety, for example. Am I sending a signal and a commitment to replacing all the leak-prone pipe and modernizing the infrastructure? That's going to take in New York and other places more than 2 decades at current replacement rates. So the PSC needs to create an environment where prospective utility employees and contractors know that there's certainty in the work, know that the PSC is looking at that and saying the value of that is important and it's being recognized. And the utility needs to see that so that they can then start focusing on what they need to do to bring in the workforce, to train them to be there for the jobs. I think it was over here first.
Kind of with this philosophy of not being prescriptive, can you kind of walk through the process that the PSC took to give zero emission credits to the nuclear power stations?
So I would love to, but she wants to know about our clean energy standard and the ZECs. There has been, and from a factual perspective, there has been some who have focused on, and there's litigation. So I can only talk about sort of from a litigation perspective. It is factual that there are folks who say that we weren't transparent enough in our process, that we didn't have enough stakeholder engagement, and that there was decision made and based on a staff analysis that came out in July, and we acted upon it in August. the decision itself and the order did address that, and that's what's the subject of. Not only was it the subject of a petition for rehearing, but it then was the subject and continues to be the subject of litigation around that. However, that does, so I can't talk specifically about that since there's pending litigation, but I think it's an excellent question, and I really appreciate that you asked it because I think it gets at the core. The core issue is this. She asked a question that might have inflamed me. She asked a question that basically challenged what I'm saying. And that's the kind of person we want coming before us. We really do. I'm telling you, it for me as a regulator pains me when I read later about what we did wrong, right? And that you didn't necessarily, not saying we did wrong in that, so just make sure, please. But it pains me that I'll read and that person is talking about things that wasn't in the record. I can only go on what's in the record. And so I want people to feel comfortable sharing their positions and sharing in a way, obviously respectfully, but sharing in a way that is really getting at the core of what we should be doing, right? So you should feel comfortable not being the one who goes along. You should feel comfortable, even if you're the only one out of all of the different stakeholders, to stake out a different position. That's part of sort of the bread and butter of what I want to have happen as a regulator. Now, how many of you have ever watched a New York Public Service Commission session? Yeah, okay. The reason I say that is that our commission sessions can at times be very caustic, can at times be some of the greatest debates and some of the worst debates have happened at our commission session. And for me, what I recognize is that the majority of the time when we're at the commission and at the session, the majority of people are not watching the debate, right? And even if they are, they're not necessarily in the weeds the way we are. And so what I try to do is also look at what it is that we have to do to move forward. So sometimes at the commission sessions, it'll be long because I won't let go of something. And it's not that, and I have sat where I have been the lone dissenter in many cases. And it's not that I am trying to derail anything. It's that I try to pick the issues that I think that the parties who are listening and the other commissioners and the staff clearly understand my position and my concerns. And I want to be challenged on it. I want people to feel that they have to explain it so that the next case that comes along, maybe somebody will focus on what she said to try to explain why it's different from that case. We recently had a rate case before us where we did not adopt in the rate case, it was a water case, a low-income program. And what I said just the other day at session was that it was not fully developed. So to adopt that program would not have actually, in my opinion, and I said all this publicly, would not have actually helped the very people we were saying we wanted to help. I wanted and this was a rate case where only the company and the staff had agreed, had, come up with a joint proposal, which is saying, we've agreed, we think this is good. So for me, it was a signal to the company and to the staff that while I will, in future cases, if it's appropriate, adopt a low-income program, I'm not looking for just the press release that says low-income program. I'm looking for real nuts and bolts, real costs, analysis and benefits. And I'm looking for them to really think about what it means and do the data. I want the data to show me what I need to be able to say, yes, this makes sense, because again, it goes back to the balance, right? The balance of the interests, and especially of the ratepayers in a rate case. So thank you for that question.
So speaking of, from the commissioner's perspective, how do you view the tension between state environmental goals like renewable portfolio standards and subsidies for renewables, and some concern among producers that because carbon is not priced into power markets, it's distorting it significantly, and with increasing clean energy, it might become a bigger problem. What's your thought on that?
My thought is that we need a lot of people around this issue. I think it is a signature issue. It's something that has a diverse subset. I don't know that we have a crystal clear answer. I think that when I first started as a regulator, as a state regulator, so my first year, New York Commission and the FERC, the federal regulator, got together in a signature conference, roundtable, not really sure what we called it, symposium maybe, in New York City. And it was public. We had people talking to us about the capacity market, lots of different people. And I remember listening, and I remember thinking, there's a lot here. And there's a lot that I have to recognize that I don't understand. And there's a lot that I have to recognize has a lot of history. And for each stakeholder, their position is strong based on their subsets and their facts. And what I thought to myself at the time, and I think of it a little differently now, is that I didn't really care whether it was the state or the federal government that had the jurisdiction. I just wanted there to be certainty in what the jurisdiction was. But I now realize that it's deeper than that. And I realize that some of that tension is that we have to have these conversations, again, outside of the event, right? Outside of the specific issue. We don't want this state or this administration to decide this issue. Again, as I say to my husband, I'm good with opinion as long as it's my opinion, right? So for me, I have to look at it and say, to be true, a true regulator and really truly making decisions, I have to look at, okay, would I feel the same if it was X? Would I feel the same? And what about if we add in this? So the whole debate around all of those issues are really going to come again to the forefront. They've been debated before. That will help us in looking at some of that, looking back at past orders, not only of individual states, but of court cases as well as the FERC. But the distinction is this. We're all new. Even some of us old-timers, we're new. There's a new FERC. There's a new state commission. There's new judges. And there's new dynamics. So again, it goes back to the offense and the policies and the implementation. We can't make these things and think, okay, we're done. We made our policy. All good now. And so we have to look at now what will drive us forward and what makes sense and try to find that pathway. Understanding the checks and balances as they should be there on others challenging us, whether it's the ZECs and litigating that issue.
Does New York do anything about regulating carbon emissions?
Yes, we have a carbon goals that we have set up, a 50 by 30, where we want to reduce our emissions. We have number, and I will, let me just hold on for a second. The governor just put out a plan on a methane reduction plan, and he had 25, I don't have it with me, he had 25 broad sweeping initiatives. all throughout the state. So different agencies will be looking at that. One of the things, the challenges again, though, comes to depending on where you sit, you may feel that that's being done in a silo or through the governor versus the legislative process. And you have to look at some of the tensions that will come from that. And also understanding that for each decision, there are going to be implementations, some good, some bad, in terms of what that means for people from an economic perspective, from business decisions that they're making, from environmental decisions that they're making. If they've just retrofitted, their facility, and now there's new regulations, and they took out a loan to retrofit, and now it doesn't meet the standards. Those are the different types of things that have to be looked at.
You mentioned earlier that you prefer an approach where you sort of set up a standard and not prescribe certain technologies. I was wondering if you could comment on the amount of technological risk that you'll let these companies take as they pursue innovative ways of meeting the standards.
That is what we. Oh, yeah. So he's asking about the risk that companies take when they're doing different types of technologies. The risk is there whether it's technology or something else. So part of it is we want our utilities, we want our companies to be healthy financially. And so because the risk is borne on the shareholders in some respect, but also on the ratepayers. And so our job as a regulator is to not put unnecessary risk on the ratepayer, and to also make sure that it's going to be covered if you take some risk, some innovation, and it doesn't work out. How you're able to learn from that and maximize. But if it's going to put unnecessary risk on the ratepayer, that's going to cause the utility to be unhealthy from a financial perspective, that's something that we need to address. So we're always doing analysis and working, and the focus on that and what Wall Street thinks about it is very important. And I'll give you an example. I realize now more than ever that words matter and actions matter, and words and actions have to fit together. So going back to our commission session, there were times in the very beginning when I was a regulator that I didn't realize, I like to think, I'm a New Yorker and I'm a downstate New Yorker, which means I shoot from the hip a lot of times, right? I say things that I have to carefully think about how it's being interpreted by someone else. So if I say something at session that says something, if I'm angry at a particular position or an action that the utility is doing, I have to be careful that it's not interpreted as a risk in downward grading the utility, right? So that I have to look at it and understand that I have to be very, very specific in what I am asking the utility to do. So for example, when something happens, the culture of the utility and how they handle it is very important. A gas safety culture is very important. So I look at all of those aspects. It's not just the penalty action that we may do on a utility. It's also looking at what are we doing to incentivize folks to make sure that their culture and their way of being of gas safety is there and it's paramount. And so part of what I look to do is also send a signal in what I'm asking them to do. What do I expect them to do? And I will give specific things so that there is measurable takeaways that then can be looked at, that Wall Street can analyze. If I'm mandating something, is it something that now the Wall Street will see as being a mandate that is just not going to be able to be done by the utility? Does it mean that this may mean that someone gets fired at the utility because of X, Y, or Z policy initiative that was done because the regulator was upset by an action of the utility? So all of those things matter. That comes with innovation and technology too. So they have to prove their case, but we have to give them the flexibility to be able to do some of that innovation so that they can grow as a company and also be responsive to the ratepayers.
I'm wondering how the PSC is addressing the changing role of electric utilities, where, for example, you have solar panels now in residences, and the individual residence becomes a generator, and so it takes away from that particular role of the electric utility.
We have a number of different, we call it our REV, or Reforming Energy Vision. We have a number of different proceedings, some would say way too many, that look at all of these different issues. And we have it in phases. So right now, we're in where we had our high-level vision for looking at the utility of the future, giving the utilities some ability and other companies to prove their cases to us. And now we're in the implementation phase, but we're in no small way done. It will take a long time. Now, when someone first hears that, it'll take a long time. They think, oh, it's going to, and I'm going to pull something up because this again goes to reaction, right? So I got today from our, from our finance director, information on rating of a company. Moody's. So this is all public. And one of the things in it stated that Moody's expects REV, that's a Reforming Energy Vision, to be slow moving. So I looked at that and thought, I'm not sure what that means in terms of the state and that they accounted for that in the analysis. And it was upgrading the company. So I wanted clarification because, again, words matter. So we only have 2 commissioners right now, right? So we usually have 5 commissioners. We're similar to FERC, who also has 5 commissioners, but they're down 2. So I took that to mean, because there's only 2 commissioners and, it's me, right? So I wanted to know if that was what they were saying, and that's a good thing, or what it is. But interestingly, the focus was on that REV will be a gradual transition, and it's not a flash cut, immediate event that the utilities don't have time to adjust to. So the focus was from a perspective of that's a good thing in that it's slow moving and gradual transition versus maybe there'll be a time when they say that and it's a negative, right? It's because it's not happening. But to the extent that, again, it goes back to events drive policies, drive implementation, and not having that knee-jerk changing everything overnight to fit the event. To the extent that we're looking at the policies from a gradual, slow-moving transition, that's kind of where we want to be. So that's a good thing.
I think we have time for one more question. Let me just see, student for sure.
Does the PSC have any interest in integrating energy markets across state lines and nationwide?
That's a loaded question. Yes. Does the PSC have interest in energy markets across state lines and integrating that? Yes, but at the same time, we have to recognize some of the in-state issues and the out-of-state issues. And we have to understand that some of our, we're a single state ISO, similar to California. So that is a good thing many times, but at the same time, we also need to recognize that regional coordination is very important. So where other states have their ISOs, they have already built in a lot of their regional coordination just because they're working on the wholesale market together. So we don't want to be the one sticking out, not integrating, but at the same time, we have to look at what that means and working through some of those challenges. And I think the focus really is on regional coordination on any level, whether it's storm damage and storm recovery issues, as well as looking at all of our different things. Because the bottom line is, we also don't want to, and that gets to the heart of, you know, the state and whether or not we're siloing and doing our own thing, is that we don't also want to cause issues for companies if we're doing certain things that aren't being done in other states, if we're mandating certain things, and they say this market is just not a market that's a real market that they feel is competitive. So we want to be able to have some initiatives that cross and are coordinated well.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Commissioner Burman.
Thank you. I do want to end on one thing, because I started, and it'll just be a second. I started on the 110th anniversary of the commission, which is this year. And one of the things that is important that I look at is that then Chair Paul Gioia, who said in his 1982 message on the commission's 75th anniversary, and I think this is still true today, as we look toward the future, one thing is clear: the Commission will continue to face difficult challenges in all areas of regulation. We must be sure our regulations continue to responsibly evolve and adapt, and that we never lose sight of our most important mission, which is reliable and affordable energy service, and we also must do so with a focus on safety, the environment, and the public. Thank you.